Hello and welcome to the Stockout. The Stockout is your show at FreightWaves about CPG companies, supply chains, and CPG companies' supply chains. I am your host, Mike Baudendistel of FreightWaves, and it has been a busy week. Sometimes the shortest weeks feel like the longest weeks, and I think that was probably true of this week, at least from our perspective here in Freight World. Lots of news coming out this week. The Knight Swift acquisition of AAA Coopers, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. More, we'll direct you to where to find even better information about that elsewhere at FreightWaves. Covered it really well. And then the Biden administration, issued an executive order to boost competitiveness of many industries, and a lot of those, directly touch transportation or some of the big shipper, industries as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and then I'll get into some of the main news stories that I saw come across this week in the world of CPG. Not a lot of companies reported earnings. That sort of starts next week with Pepsi and Conagra, but there still were things such as the Tyson frozen chicken recall. A couple of companies filing IPO for filings. I saw some interesting stats from former colleague of mine who's one of the top analysts following the consumer space. I'll talk about some of the research that he's published. So we'll get into some of those things. So stick with us. But first, a word from our sponsor, Echo Global Logistics. Trust the experts at Echo Global Logistics for all your freight transportation and CPG shipping needs. Whether you are a Fortune 100 CPG company or a specialty food manufacturer, Echo has solutions to fit your needs. With their dedicated team, as well as EchoShip, a self-service shipping portal allowing you to quote, book, ship, and track, Echo has you covered. Technology at your fingertips and experts by your side, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. To find out how Echo can simplify your transportation management, please visit www.echo.com/CPG today. So big thanks to Echo Global Logistics for sponsoring this podcast. And the way I'd like to start today is really just talk a little bit about the big news flow that happened this week. And the main sort of news item, Knight Swift is going to acquire AAA Cooper, and the reason that's so unique is that you have the biggest truckload company in the country acquiring a regional LTL company. Those are very different businesses. It's not something that you see often, and that acquisition was covered really well on FreightWaves.com, in particular on one of our other shows, which was Great Quarter Guys, which I listened to last night. About 10 minutes in, our CEO and founder, Craig Fuller, described his thoughts on the deal, which really sort of coming from an area of expertise with him having grown up in the truckload industry. And just what was so interesting about it that sort of other people couldn't describe was a lot of sort of the internal dynamics in terms of the management of the various companies, the board composition, sort of all of those things that I don't think you're going to get from reading an analyst report by most of the Wall Street analysts that cover the deal. Also have a good article on FreightWaves.com describing our hot takes of the deal. We have about 6 or 7 individuals participated that from FreightWaves. Sort of what's your initial thoughts before much else comes out. And I think all of us just put our thoughts in there without really looking at what other people wrote, and there was some little bit of a differing opinions, but I think for the most part, at least my perspective coming from former financial analyst is okay. I can see why the stock market reacted favorably to this announcement. Why shares of Knight Swift were up. Oftentimes the acquiring company their shares go down, but this one sort of checks all the boxes. It gets Knight Swift into LTL area, which has been a faster growing area, considering that of the proliferation of the smaller packages, e-commerce, getting shipments closer to consumers, and it also diversifies Knight Swift into area that is has higher barriers to entry. Typically has better pricing because it's much more concentrated and less competitive. And I think the resulting debt load should be manageable. We've seen similar levels of debt after Knight acquired Swift, which was a lot more successful, despite the fact there were a lot of naysayers with that transaction as well. So you do have an acquirer here with Knight Swift that has a track record of successfully completing and integrating, acquisitions. Swift being the biggest one, but there were others as well. So I would encourage you to check out both Great Quarter Guys this week and the Hot Takes article on FreightWaves.com. And really, the other big thing this week from a transportation perspective is this Biden administration executive order for all these different industries in order to enhance competition. Seems like the goal there is to, promote competition. So ultimately, there is lower prices filtered down, to the consumer level. So instead of sort of, taking any, responsibility for the, rapid inflation, sort of saying, well, certain industries are just too concentrated, and you just have too much power in the hands of the sellers. And so it was kind of a laundry list of industries that this pertains to. I mean, things like hearing aids, things like communications, but really the ones that directly hit transportation. It's on the railroad industry, which of course, very concentrated industry, and talking about things like the reciprocal switching, which is basically what that means is, if you have a railroad that is basically, one railroad serves a customer, there's only basically a captive shipper. Under reciprocal switching, that the railroad would have to quote a competing offer, using a different railroad that would interchange, on that railroad's track. So it's not quite open access like in Australia, where anyone can go on anyone's track, but it is a way to enhance, competition on the railroad. So they asked the Surface Transportation Board, which is the executive arm that regulates the railroads, to take a good hard look at that. And that's something that the Surface Transportation Board has sort of, punted on, recently. So that could have, have implications for the railroad there, and it could also, potentially impact this pending acquisition of, Canadian National is, likely to acquire Kansas City Southern. Pending, regulatory approval, it could make it so the bar is higher for Canadian National to complete that deal. Of course, it already is, pretty high, considering that the railroad has to demonstrate that the mergers at this point actually enhance competition. It just cannot just be a neutral. So there's been a lot of discussion about that here this week at FreightWaves. There's also parts of that executive order pertaining to the maritime industry, which that's a concentrated industry too, about 80% market share for the three major ocean alliances, and they want the Federal Maritime Commission to take a hard look at detention and demurrage charges that the shippers have to pay. So a lot going on there. And then there's even things that pertain to the CPG industry that I should bring up. On the agriculture side, stricter rules for what is considered a product that's manufactured in the USA, and then potentially ruling to allow independent companies to repair farm equipment and those various pieces of equipment that instead of having those captive to the company that manufactures that equipment, which I think that would be a good thing. And so when you sort of go down the list, I mean, some of these things make more sense than others. The ocean side of things, really there's not the same degree of barriers to entry, because there's no capacity constraints on the ocean or constraints with ordering ocean equipment, at least in the longer term. I mean, near term there's always constraints because it takes a long time to build those vessels, but in longer term doesn't have the same constraints as the railroad, which there's really not any additional railroad track being built. There was also something in there that the Class 1 railroads should give priority to Amtrak and passenger rail, which the relationship between passenger and freight rail has been somewhat antagonistic, I would say. And Biden seems to be a big supporter of passenger rail, having commuted from Delaware to Washington D.C. for so many years. But so it'll be interesting to see how all this plays out. But those were sort of the highlights, at least from my perspective, on the executive orders. So on to CPG. I've got 6 topics here that I'm going to go through that I flagged as being the sort of big CPG topics sort of the hour, of the week. The first topic is Tyson recalls 8.5 million pounds of frozen chicken. It's a lot of chicken. And Tyson USDA announced, sort of jointly announced his recall 8.5 million pounds of frozen, fully cooked chicken for the possible exposure of Listeria, which is a bacteria that's harmful primarily to older adults and pregnant women. And basically, the CDC notified the USDA that there was evidence that this was linked to food. And then, following an investigation, it was linked. There was evidence, at least, linking those cases to a Tyson food plant in Dexter, Missouri, for products that were made sort of late last year into the most primarily in the first quarter of this year. And this were products that were sold to hospitals, nursing homes, restaurants, schools, the military, et cetera. This includes both chicken products that say they have the Tyson name brand and also those that are private label. And sort of Tyson's comment essentially was, doing this out of an abundance of caution. Although it did seem like they were going to have to do it anyway, even if it wasn't voluntary. But by the fact that making it voluntary, I think it was maybe a good PR move for them. And you've seen this with other types of foods in recent years. And you may recall the Dole bag salad situation in 2016, 2017. A lot of people got terribly sick from bag salad. Believe that was also the same Listeria, which led to that recall as well, which in turn has led to greater scrutiny of various food items. But this one, it looks like they're catching it at least early. Whether it was actually linked to that plant or not. So hopefully we can put this behind us relatively quickly. And it's just sort of one other sort of issue with food supply chains where Tyson has been having trouble recently with getting enough workers with the sort of the labor shortage here in the U.S. I mean, they've talked about having higher rates of absenteeism, where it's getting difficult for people to show up just because of the high unemployment benefits and various stimulus packages and those things. And chicken was also one of the things that there were stockouts earlier in the year, things like chicken wing shortages. So it's just sort of one other thing that makes things difficult for CPG companies to get the food they need. Topic number 2 is grocery retailers and grocery wholesalers are stockpiling items. So this was an article from the Wall Street Journal I thought was interesting. And really the grocery retailers and wholesalers, and really this pertains more to the wholesalers. There's only so much space at the retail level in most cases, and the reason is twofold, which I think is not going to be a surprise to people that have listened to the show or just been plugged into the news. Is inflation is a lot of the CPG companies, most of the CPG companies are raising prices, if not now, but then later in the fall. So a lot of the pricing increases are coming in September. So that's coming up here. And so they wanted to get ahead of some of those price increases, stockpiling, items. And then the other reason is just to avoid stockouts, which, even though we're past, I think the panic stage of, not having, enough, of certain, consumer goods, it's still a lot of consumers' very favorite items are not, sort of fully there. I mean, we've seen things like, not having, enough meat or the right types of meats, or McCormick spices or various other things. And there was a good stat in the article about that is typically a retailer places an order, and about 90% of that order is filled by the wholesaler because they have it in stock and are able to deliver it. Now it's gone from about 90% to about 80%. So it is about a 10% delta where retailers aren't getting the items they need, and in turn the consumers aren't getting their very favorite items. Our host of FreightWaves now, Kaylee Nix, asked me, are consumers going to run out of food? Are people going to starve? People are not going to starve. They're just maybe not going to get their very favorite items when they go to the store, which is disappointing. Not the end of the world, but maybe it is if you're grocery retailer and you're short on those items that gets consumers into the store and keeps them in the store to buy some of the higher margin items. And one stat is, another stat is, Associated Wholesale Grocers, which is the largest grocery wholesaler, has about 15 to 20% more, inventory than it typically does. So I guess that, constitutes a stockpile, and usually there would not be, that degree of, variability. And so as we go forward here, it'll be interesting to see if, Kroger's comments sort of come to fruition, where they say, well, consumers really don't tend to notice some of these price increases that are more than about 4%. So that's sort of the range, sort of 4 to 5%, where a lot of these CPG companies are trying to keep their price increases to, even if their costs are rising sort of high single digits, and if that means they have some near-term cost pressure, sort of so be it. So get your favorite grocery items quickly. Maybe you should do some stockpiling yourself before prices rise, and your favorite items are tough to find. Topic number 3: the drought is hitting almond producers particularly hard. So you've probably seen stuff on this, or if you listen to the FreightWaves meteorologist Nick Austin, he talks about this a lot. There's a drought in the western, let's call it the western half of the country, western third of the country. It's hitting a wide range of crops. But almonds are kind of the one that's been singled out here recently, and the reason for that is they're a thirsty crop. They use about twice as much water as other crops, for a relative to sort of most others, and about 80% of the world's supply of almonds are grown in California. Sort of California is unique because the climate is uniquely hospitable. And because it is uniquely hospitable, that's where a lot of farmers have decided to invest, because that really gives them a competitive advantage. And so almond production for a lot of California farmers is more profitable than other types of agriculture products. So that's where they've been devoting their acreage. And a lot of farmers upset about this, but they're destroying their orchards sort of prematurely because they can't get the proper irrigation to the almond trees. So they're basically bulldozing these trees, which would normally have a few more years of production of almonds, because of the lack of water. And that's been obviously a big issue, has potential to really move the market. And almonds have been a growing crop, not just because the California farmers are using that. That's where how they're using their resources, but also just the consumption is rising. I think there's a lot of interest in plant-based alternatives to milk, and almond is the second most used milk substitute, about a 60% market share. That may decline with Oatly's advertising, which is absolutely everywhere to try to get people to buy oat milk. And would also mention that the drought has the potential to cause an increase in agriculture prices broadly. I mean, agriculture prices have been on a tear, sort of peaking in May, and then they've come back. And if you talk about corn and soybeans, which a lot of that production is more in the middle part of the country, those are down about 20 to 25% from their highs. But a lot of the California crops, could get pretty scarce with the drought. Topic number 4: Stifel Consumer Analyst finds pricing up in the low single digits before an anticipated acceleration. And then he also finds that that a lot of the major CPG brands continue to take share from private labels. So this was from analyst named Chris Grohe, who, this is the company I used to work at. I still get some of the research in my inbox. And he tracked 61 food categories for the week ending June 27th. And what he found was that overall, the sales increased 2.3% on flat volume. So, basically pricing and mix making up the difference. And he also noted that the volume of private label declined 4.8%. So you have sort of the national brands growing just a little bit, private label declining. So the major brands, which took a lot of market share during the pandemic, still seem to be taking market share. And one of the reasons for that, he highlights, is that the price gap between the national brands and the private label brands is 31%, which is down 70 basis points compared to the prior year. So if the gap between the national brands and the private label brands is lower, you're more likely to opt for the national brand. That's probably the one that most consumers, really want. And so he's estimating that, overall food costs likely to rise in the mid to high single digits in 2021. But notes that this is after a deflationary 2020. So prices came down in 2020. They're rising in 2021, but against 2019 levels, sort of the price increases don't seem as severe as they looked otherwise, which is one counter argument to all the concern about inflation as well. We're comparing to 2020 doesn't make a lot of sense. It should really be compared to 2019. And then the other counterpoint is, well, look how fast the economy is growing. You would expect that level of inflation. So some interesting stats there, but I think that's good news for the national brands, not so great news for the private label brands, and still demonstrates that consumers willing to spend premium on consumer packaged goods, particularly the healthier alternatives in consumer packaged goods. Topic number 5: Dole Foods and Chobani filed a prospectus. Each filed a prospectus to go public. Dole Foods said that the IPO be a condition of the planned merger with Total Produce, which would make Dole the world's largest produce company. Some of the highlights from this SEC filing, they left out a lot of the valuation stuff, as they often do, sort of in the initial run. But company predicts a 2.7% annual growth rate for their business between 2020 and 2025 in both the U.S. and Europe. And the reason for that is the expectation that consumers are going to eat healthier. Of course, the U.S. and Europe populations are not growing 2.7% a year. I mean, a lot of the European countries, the population is declining. U.S., it's growing less than 1% a year. So they are expecting that sort of a mix, shift from processed unhealthy foods to healthier foods, which I think makes sense given what we've seen in the marketplace. Dole's revenue mix: 27% bananas, 45% pineapples, and rest 28% is vegetables and other things. So it's a good mix to address healthy eating issues. Also related to healthy eating, Greek yogurt maker Chobani filed a confidential submission to go public. So, I wasn't able to look at that one and can't give you any stats, from it. But, there was an article in Wall Street Journal earlier this year that says they're seeking a valuation between $7 billion and $10 billion. Of course, Chobani is the company that makes the Greek yogurt, really responsible for popularizing a lot of that Greek yogurt, which is starting to be copied by some of the established yogurt brands. I think a lot of the consumers like that because it's a way to get some protein sort of first thing in the morning, and something that I think consumers, as we sort of come out of this pandemic, are just looking for ways to eat a little bit healthier and get a little bit more protein, and just kind of live in general a little bit more active lifestyle. Which also ties into topic number 6: is Molson Coors, the beer giant, plans to fundamentally change its portfolio as consumers' tastes shift away from beer. And of course, one of the reasons consumers shifts or tasting away from going away from beer is fewer calories, fitness, all those things. And so, according to this market analysis, beer consumption in the U.S. Declined 7.5% from 2015 to 2020. And then if you go back to 2000, in 20 years, declined 11.5% from 2020 to 2015, or 20 from 2000 to 2020. And then, beer's market share declined 3.5 percentage points to 44%. So beer is making up 44% of all alcoholic beverages, but it was well over 50% for a period of time. And then even within that declining beer market, Molson Coors market share is declining, losing ground to primarily the craft beers and things. So their market share has declined about 8 points since 2010 to 21%. So what they're trying to do is mitigate some of these losses, go into things like hard seltzer. They have a partnership with Topo Chico, various other things, even looking at things like energy drinks, non-alcoholic drinks, ready-made cocktails, those type of things. So I think it's pretty important to understand the declining nature of the beer market for the freight companies that are hauling freight. I mean, you do see something similar when you look at what AB InBev is saying. I mean, they sort of acknowledge it's a declining market too. They're just trying to grow into adjacent markets faster than sort of the traditional, Bud Light or Coors Light or Miller Light is declining, which seems to be declining. Let's call it 2 to 4%, each year. So people are drinking less beer, eating more fruit, and would encourage you to do that this weekend. Hope everyone has a good weekend. Next week on the Stockout, I'm going to be discussing the results of Pepsi and ConAgra. So plenty to talk about in food next week, and whatever other news comes across in world of CPG or freight transportation.